Okay, moving on. I'm turning to the issue of abortion once again. I've dealt with many aspects of this over the last few weeks. The whole of season 3 has had something on abortion in every episode. But today I'm dealing with something quite specific. I'm dealing with some of the arguments that I've observed from pro-choicers or pro-abortion people. And I want to note something about those arguments. It seems to me more generally that they've actually gone through something of a metamorphosis over a period of time. It was once the case, you see, that arguments for abortion were designed around the idea of trying to say, well, it's not actually the killing of a child. It's not actually the taking of a life. It's not actually the removal of the opportunity for a human being to live, and therefore it's not morally reprehensible. It's not what you say it is. And they said, well, it's not a person, for example. It's my body. It's one body, or therefore I can choose. Or it's a matter of healthcare, not a matter of human rights, because it's so inconsequential. It's just like expelling waste from the body. It's a clump of cells. It's a product of conception. And you had all of these arguments. But of course, over time, science has been against us on these things. Science showed us what we always knew. Science showed us that it's not one body, it's two. A zygote has the entire DNA blueprint for a human person. It's not your body. It's in your body. It's another body. It's another human person. But the arguments, of course, persisted, and the arguments said, well, this little human has not yet achieved the status of personhood. It's not life worth protecting at this stage. It's primitive. It's a clump of cells. It's, as I said, a product of conception. It's a little nothing. It's just getting rid of it. There's no moral implications whatsoever. But again, of course, science was against us. A heart beats at 4 weeks. I agree with New South Wales Treasurer Dominic Perrottet when he said he couldn't support a law that stops a beating heart. Good point. Pain is felt by 16 weeks, if not sooner. Barely 12 weeks is up before the child is yawning, stretching, making facial expressions. By 22 weeks, it'll live outside the womb. Ultrasound images are being credited with a massive surge of pro-lifers in the younger generations because it's a little person. And not to see that and understand it from the images that we get alone is to be willfully blind. Surgeons who operate on these babies say they, of course, respond to pain. Of course, they need anaesthetic. But of course, Ben Carson recently said quite remarkably that they respond to care and warmth as well. They are individually existing little humans who have sensory functions rapidly developing. But see, as these things become increasingly clear, especially with the advances of medicine and science, of course, the pro-choicers don't change their arguments. Of course, they don't change their minds. They don't admit any error. Instead, they simply make up new angles. And I find that in that changing argument, they've become more and more brazen. They don't any longer actually argue that this isn't, in fact, an act of killing, and therefore it's not outrageous. I find the overwhelming focus of the arguments now is to say, rather, it doesn't matter what I'm doing, because I want to do it. It's contraception. It's my right to equality. It's my body, therefore my choice, with an emphasis now on the I'm choosing this. It's autonomy. It's rights. It's me, myself, and I, because I'm deciding. And therefore I am deciding what is good and what is not. Like God, if I do something, it is good. Like God, if I say something, it makes it real. And I will say what is right and wrong. I will do things that make right and wrong. I will say what's sin and what's righteousness. I'll say what's moral and what's immoral. I'll decide based on how I feel about the situation and what I ultimately do. And that will create reality. Kate Fairman, Greens MLC, in the upper house said this: the majority of adults in this country have sex for enjoyment. And sometimes that will result in pregnancies that are not wanted. This is the world we live in right now. This is our world where half of us are women and where we demand full equality. Clementine Ford tweeted, abortion is a form of contraception. It is the last resort for people for whom other contraceptives have failed. It's not a moral wrong. There's a verbal exchange recorded at the Upper House inquiry between Greens MLC Abigail Boyd and Anglican Archbishop of Sydney Glenn Davies. And Ms Boyd says that these arguments against abortion, quote, are a mistrust of women to make their own decisions for their own bodies and for themselves. The Archbishop replies, if it were merely a matter of choice for your own body, then I could understand. But when a pregnant mother holds a genetically distinct unborn child, it is not merely her own body. I reject the proposition that this is with regard to her own body. In terms of pro-choice or no choice, what about the choice of the unborn child? Where does he or she find a place in this debate? Ms. Boyd replies, I think we would differ on how we conceive of a fetus. Davies says, it is genetically distinct, is it not? Boyd says, it is genetically distinct. Yes, that is right. She says, right, it's true. It's a separate human being, genetically distinct. But see, for her, what's more important, it's her opening statement, the ability of women to make their own decisions and therefore to demand full equality. It's very politically correct language, but it just barely hides the mindset of our times that says, yes, I know what I'm doing, but I have decided that I will do it. And because I have decided, it is good. Because I am good and I make good, and I decide what's good because I am God now. And when I speak, it makes it right. When I decide, it makes it right. That is our world. And it's not a world. It's not a world in which we believe that there is supreme, transcendent, objective truth over us all to which we are accountable, which binds us. It doesn't believe in that anymore. We're well past that. But see, likewise, it's not actually a world which says there's no truth. Notice that. We're not there. We're not in a place that says truth isn't real, it doesn't exist. We're not arguing with silly people who think that truth isn't a thing. They know it's a thing. Also, we're not actually arguing with a world where the language of, well, this is my truth and that's your truth is very often used. I don't see that much. The more specific articulation of what's going on in our time is that it is a world that says, yeah, I know that might be true, but I don't care. Instead, what I care about is what I want. It's what I feel. It's what I have decided to do. And that's just more important. And that's just what matters because I feel and I want. And so the argument becomes circular. That is where we are today. A world in which we have finally decided that we have God's authority to create right and wrong merely by acting and by speaking, to determine good and evil. And we believe earnestly that that is the only way to be happy, to be empowered to be as gods, as was the sin that tempted our first parents. And we react with such anger against those who stand in the way because it's like that's an act of blasphemy to affront my sense of deity, that you would say that I am wrong. Jeremy Rivkin powerfully says this. He's a very influential policy advisor and economist and so forth, quite influential in the EU. He says this, we no longer feel ourselves to be guests in someone else's home and therefore obliged to make our behaviour conform to a set of pre-existing cosmic rules. It's our creation now. We make the rules. We establish the parameters of reality. We create the world. And because we do, we no longer feel beholden to outside forces. We no longer have to justify our behaviour. For we are now the architects of the universe. We are responsible to nothing outside ourselves, for we are the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. I think he's just saying what people unconsciously believe. It is truly a Romans 1 world in which we worship and serve creature rather than creator. And it's interesting that the example given in Romans 1 of that phenomenon is somebody denying natural reality. Somebody saying, for example, well, it's the homosexual example. And Paul saying, well, nature itself shows you that's not the way it's meant to be. But of course, we believe that what we want and desire is more important. And we should pursue it. And that we can create what's right and wrong. We can create reality itself. And it's a very, very difficult problem to overcome. Because you can't argue with a generation like this by saying, well, see how good my logic is. See how good my arguments are. Look how true my truth is. Can you not see it? Because it's not that they don't see it. It's that they actually don't care, and they can't imagine a world in which they would care because they feel different. And it's a world actually in which they not only don't care, but they are angered by your truth because your truth is oppressive, because it affronts them, because it presses down upon them and demands things of them that they're not prepared to give. And so it is oppression. Michel Foucault, one of the great postmodernist thinkers, said exactly that. Truth claims are power claims. They are oppressive. They victimize people. Run from them. Do not engage. And so I get a little frustrated when I see so many Christians in the public squares who really do think that the logic of argument is still the way forward. In a godless but still secular and scientific world, logical argument had great currency and power. But we are seeing something. And what we are seeing is that logic and argument no longer means diddly squat to a new generation. And in fact, they will flee it. And the whole hard wiring of their brain from cradle to where they are now is been set up in such a way as to say it doesn't matter. In fact, you are bad for pretending that it does. Someone asked me a while ago, when will this whole transgender phenomenon fall in a heap and people realize it's patent nonsense? I said, well, they don't think like you anymore. It's not going to be that way. The only way that it'll fall in a heap and they'll realize it's nonsense if some dreadful, shocking, disruptive and affronting hardship befalls them in which they have to confront reality. You know, a great war or something, some crisis when people forget all this ideology and they have to deal with the brass tacks of the real world, like it or not. But if that doesn't come, do you know something? There's something else that we have to be brave enough to do. And it is testify to something else, not just stop at logic. And we have done wrong by just stopping at logic for so long. Paul wrote into a world just like this in Romans 1. And he starts by pointing something out. For a generation like this, there is one thing he could rely on, and it wasn't his own power of argument. It wasn't his own good logic. It wasn't convincing people of truth claims. No, he said, I can only rely on what? The power of God for salvation to all who believe. He said, I have to go above my pay grade. Romans 1:16. And therefore, I am unashamed of the gospel because it's the gospel that is God's power to change people, to enlighten darkened eyes, to enliven dead minds, to make people see the truth and acknowledge the truth and believe the truth. He says, I need a higher power. I need God's power, and I need it through His tools, God's tools. God's tools are the scriptures. God's tools are the gospel. God's tools are the truths, the lives, the testimonies of Christians that witness back to that. And so I say, yeah, I'm in the political square, I'm in the public square, but I've never been here as an end in itself. I've only ever been here because of Christ who sits behind all that we say. And from time to time, increasingly actually, we just need to be clear about that. Because without His power and the tools that He's given us to fight this fight, we cannot win. The culture is at a point where that has never been clearer. And so that's the world in which we live. Sadly, my truth, what I say is real. And yet God has given us the tools that can even overcome that barrier. So let's take them up and use them with confidence. In all that we say and do, point back to the truth that we actually believe in and stand on.